This episode touches on some sensitive themes related to violence, so please listen and watch with care.
You couldn't wear Calvin Klein because it stands for Crip Killer. You couldn't wear British Knights because it stands for Blood Killer. All these kids, I realize, are using social media in all these ways to stay safe. Myths that I've been told my whole life about people only committing violence out of kind of like sheer evil or disregard for humanity were BS.
Hi, I'm Ciaran Thapar and this is Safe, a conversation about violence affecting children and young people with adults who are trying to stop it. Is social media making young people more violent? Professor Forrest Stuart spent 5 years on the south side of Chicago hanging out with teenage gang members trying to find out. As director of the Stanford Ethnography Lab and the author of several award-winning books, his research explores how poverty, violence and policing intertwine in the modern American city. Forrest has flown to London to have a conversation about how his childhood experiences led him into academia, why we shouldn't make any quick assumptions about the relationship between social media and violence, and how we can apply his research to life here in the UK. Professor Forrest Stuart, welcome to Safe.
Thanks, this is great. I'm so glad to be here.
You're the first guest to have flown into London to have this conversation, so we really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
How did you keep safe as a child?
Oh, gosh. You know, I grew up in the 80s and 90s outside of Los Angeles at like the height of the gang wars. This is big like Crips and Bloods time. And I think like most of my friends, I kept safe by really meticulously curating how I moved around in space. I don't know, this was a time when, you know, our moms would like not let us wear red, not let us wear blue.
Okay.
You couldn't wear Calvin Klein because it stands for Crip Killer. You couldn't wear British Knights because it stands for Blood Killer. You couldn't wear Raiders gear. You couldn't wear Rams gear. So it was like no sports logos. And then, you know, moms and dads being really careful of making sure that we weren't walking down, you know, the wrong streets in the wrong neighborhood. So really kind of curating what we were doing, how we were looking to stay safe.
And how did those experiences shape you?
Oh boy.
But I suppose also, how did the, you know, inevitable positive and playful elements of being a child shape you? Like both sides of it.
Yeah. You know, I mean, this is something that like I haven't really thought, that came to me as I got older. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized like just how important kind of exploration and freedom and experimentation are for kids. And I realized that by having to curate so much of what I was doing. You know, there was this kind of ritual when you would make a new friend or you try to date somebody in middle school or in high school. Like you had to figure out like what neighborhood they lived in. You had to figure out, you know, was their family a blood family? Was their family a Crip family? To make sure that, you know, their cousin wasn't at war with your cousin, or, you know, their block wasn't at war with your block. And it took me until being an adult to realize like how much that really stifled so much of that exploration, like not being able to be friends with somebody because, you know, violence might be coming down the pike. You know, I was lucky enough to move somewhere where gang violence wasn't kind of like an organizing principle of life. And I think it was then that I really realized how much more playful, you know, I could be, you know, getting into the kind of innocent trouble that young people get into, you know, going somewhere where you're not supposed to go, but that not necessarily meaning that you might suffer violence.
And presumably a lot of those experiences where you grew up, family life, what you saw, it drew you towards sociology eventually.
Yeah.
So talk me through that.
Yeah. So I think sociology is the kind of natural outgrowth of those exact childhood experiences. So I think growing up in a violent city, there's all kinds of myths and narratives told about why the violence exists, right? Evil people, immoral people, people making bad choices. And I think I internalized all of that. And it wasn't until I escaped that and went to college that like I was introduced to things like structural forces, right? Like poverty and disinvestment and these kinds of things. And it was then when I realized, oh, the kind of myths that I've been told my whole life about people only committing violence out of kind of like sheer evil or disregard for humanity were BS. Like these were not true whatsoever. And, it was then that I started to realize that my city was a lot like a lot of other violent cities, right? So
your city was?
my city, I grew up in San Bernardino, California. It's about 60 miles east of Los Angeles. And in the 1990s, we led the United States in per capita homicide rate. And so it was very violent. This is not a distinguishing characteristic that I think any city wants. And at one point in time, I think we were battling Detroit for the poorest major city and the poorest county as well. It's San Bernardino County, the poorest county. And it wasn't until I went to college and started thinking systematically about what's in common in all of these cities like Detroit, Los Angeles, Oakland, these places known for violence. And it was, we all suffered the same kind of dislocation of jobs at the same time. I remember growing up, our Air Force Base closed, which was a huge employer for a lot of people. It was a time when the United States closed a lot of Air Force bases. We had like this kind of like steel mill that closed as well at the same time. And then a major rail hub was located in the city. And so these were blue collar union kinds of jobs that really sustained not just people in that industry, but all these other industries connected to them. And so when they left, everything kind of bottoms out. And it was very clear to me to see, oh, this is why there's guys on the corner, right? This is why there's guys controlling turf with guns, because what else are they going to do, right? Like they need to make an income somewhere. And so these informal economies pop up, and this is not an economy, or this is not a job where you can like go to a small claims court, right? If somebody steals your money or doesn't pay you, like you have to settle this on the streets. You have to settle this kind of stuff with guns. And so it was finally kind of seeing these commonalities of state retrenchment, of kind of economic collapse, that made me think about the kinds of things that sociologists think about. Are these kind of structural factors, the way that these individual lives that seem quite unique are actually part of these patterns that we can explain by looking at larger forces, politics, the economy, society at large.
There's a practice within sociology that is your bag.
Yeah.
Ethnography. We're going to kind of take it as a given that a lot of the research we're going to be talking about in this conversation
Definitely
has come out of ethnography. I just wondered if you could explain what it is.
Yeah, definitely. I think, it's a mouthful of a word that I think maybe not a lot of people know about. So ethnography comes, originally it was anthropologists kind of going to remote places and trying to figure out what the culture of kind of locals is. And sociologists took this method of embedding yourself in a community, observing closely, and we began to turn our sights onto the United States. And so I'm an urban ethnographer, which means I spend years and years in urban communities trying to understand really what the crux of ethnography is trying to understand the world through the lenses and eyes of the communities we're interested in. And if I had to boil ethnography down to like a single kind of mission, it's to try to show how something that looks very, very irrational from the outside, once you're walking in that person's shoes, looks as rational as it can possibly be. And so, I kind of hinted at this thinking about violence and thinking about economic dislocation, but I think from the outside, for groups of the population who have never had to, fight through the street economy just to put food on the table, or for people who have never struck out getting jobs because they have a criminal record. I think for those folks, it might be difficult to understand why someone might pick up street hustling or violent street hustling as a way of life. And ethnography, one of the things I've done with my studies is to take outsiders into that world and try to explain, look, if you were faced with these same exact conditions, you would do this, or perhaps, you might find yourself being even more violent. And so that's really something that kind of underlies the kind of ethnography that I do.
If you're enjoying this conversation, hit subscribe or follow to make sure you don't miss out on the next one. And feel free to leave a comment or a review. You arrive in Chicago in 2012, having, again, made your name, with your first book. Talk me through why you were there and what was happening in the city at the time.
So I moved to Chicago when I took a job at University of Chicago, which is a wonderful university with deep tradition of ethnographic research. So it's the birthplace essentially of American sociology. It's the birthplace of sociological ethnography. So it was a real honor to join that department. And I moved there at a time when violence had started spiking. In the United States, we saw this incredible spike in violence in the 80s and the 90s, and then it kind of bottomed out. Then we saw some of the safest times the United States has ever seen, and we could go on and on for hours trying to speculate as to why this is. What's interesting is like criminologists still don't quite have a consensus answer as to why crime went down, but the crack economy changed, and we see a lot of prosecution strategies happening with gangs, and the landscape just changes a ton. But right around 2012, we see violence really taking off again. And for everyone across the United States, for everyone in Chicago, there's this real panic. And folks are looking around trying to explain why this is the case. And I arrive while the city is in panic, trying to figure this out. And I knew moving to Chicago, doing the kind of research that I do, that there was no way that I could be there without trying to get on the ground and actually come up with some kind of explanation as to why this was happening. And I was aided a little bit, or maybe inspired a little bit, by some of the narratives as to why this was happening. And the biggest narrative that was happening at the time was social media, right? The mayor of Chicago, the police superintendent of Chicago came out and over from about 2012 until at least maybe like 2018, laid blame for all this violence on social media. And the narrative was, we have these unruly bands of callous, insensitive, homicidal youth running around shooting each other based on an insult that someone has lobbed at them on Twitter. And there was something about the way that young people were being portrayed in the media that reminded me a lot of the way young people had been portrayed in the 80s and 90s when I was a kid. So when I was a kid, that's when, at least in the United States, we had this myth of the black super predator, right? This almost like subhuman young black man who cares nothing for your life or his life. He just is driven to kill. And even though the social media element was new, it felt really similar. And I had seen what had happened in the 80s and 90s when we allowed this kind of narrative to proliferate, which was, we see the rise of mass incarceration. So we see draconian punitive laws come through and treat these young people like black super predators. And so I was very worried that we were going to see this again. And so I said, I know exactly what I need to do. I need to do what an ethnographer does. I need to go talk to young people who are at risk of being shot and who are shooting people, and ask them whether or not, or see with my own eyes whether or not this narrative was in fact correct.
And this is what produced what would end up being your second book, Ballad of the Bullet.
Right.
In order to write that, you spent time with gang members on the South Side. Take me to the South Side of Chicago. We're pretty far from there right now.
Yeah.
So take me there. What's it like? And what did you learn hanging out with young people there?
The South Side of Chicago is, it's really the heart of Black America. This is one of the main cities where Black folks, after emancipation, move, right? They move from the south of the United States up to the north of the United States into Chicago, into the South Side of Chicago. Even like the term ghetto, this was kind of originated in the United States to talk about what at the time was a kind of thriving city within a city. We've got Black newspapers and Black institutions and Black banks and, all these kinds of parallel institutions, because Black folks in the United States were not allowed to exist within white society. And much like the story of my youth, the story of San Bernardino, We see steel plants close. We see, economic dislocation. We see union jobs disappear overseas. And the South Side kind of bottoms out. And we see gangs rise. And it's been pretty bleak ever since the 1990s. When I get there, what we have are a lot of housing projects that have been built in the early 20th century being torn down. And what we see are all of these gangs that had arisen at one point in time to sell crack cocaine, this kind of hierarchical corporate structure that controlled a lot of these neighborhoods, start to fizzle out. And we see gangs being pushed around into other neighborhoods. And we see, and this was very much on the minds and lips of Chicagoans when I moved there in 2012, what they would call these balkanized gangs. And so gangs kind of fracture and become these almost like block level cliques or factions or groups that no longer have kind of gang allegiances to the big old gangs that we used to know about, right? The Black Peace Stones or the Gangster Disciples. These are kind of classic Chicago gangs. These kinds of things don't matter anymore. Gang colors don't necessarily matter anymore. And it becomes a bit more of a little bit of a Wild West in terms of violence. And I think that this is why folks can't really get their head around like what's explaining violence, because it doesn't seem to be following the same rules that it used to before. So we're seeing, gangster disciple violence against gangster disciples. Black Peace Stones are shooting at Black Peace Stones.
And their forefathers would never have done that.
Right.
But now that's splintering.
Right. And so this was the real puzzle, that many of these gangs, we call them like we call those old gangs like the corporate gangs. And we call them corporate gangs because they operate almost like in a franchise model. And if you were a 13-year-old kid, you knew that, you would formally join the gang and you would be able to work your way up into the ranks. You'd be given a corner and some drugs, maybe a gun. And if you sold well on that corner, then you would run the corner. And if you ran the corner well, you'd become a lieutenant. If you ran multiple corners well, you'd become a chief. Suddenly, right around the teens, 20 teens, when I get there, because the crack economy is gone and heroin has moved in, more synthetic drugs have moved in, you don't need a kind of corporate structure anymore. So like the kind of like reason for existing for the corporate gang disappear. As I mentioned, those housing projects, they demolish the housing projects because there's a lot of crime in the housing projects, but they demolish the housing projects. And so what you would have, you'd have a whole housing project that would be one big corporate gang. Well, when those are demolished, it spreads those folks out into all kinds of different neighborhoods. So what you end up having is a bunch of middle schoolers who have been dislocated from their housing projects. And so you've got like, think of 13-year-olds, it's like a Black Peace Stone with a gangster disciple and a Black disciple, and they all have to get to school safely. And so they band up together, they give themselves a new name, they brand themselves a gang. And in order to stay safe, they essentially, whether they want to or not, kind of become a gang. And so this is the kind of landscape, the violence landscape that I move into when I arrive in Chicago.
And you quite quickly focused on their use of social media.
Yeah. This was something really surprising. I had heard from, the superintendent that social media was to blame. I didn't quite believe it. I did not have a Twitter account. I did not have an Instagram. I had a Facebook account that like maybe I used every so often to like keep track of like what my mom was up to and like what silly stuff like my high school friends were getting into. And so I had no interest whatsoever in social media. And then, I started running these violence prevention after school programs, and I would sit around with young people and we would talk about what they had to do to stay safe, just like you asked me. And they would tell me all of these strategies that were tied to social media. And, it would just blow my mind. So, a lot of the young people, what they would do is they would wake up in the morning, every single morning, and they would open up various social media apps, and they would search the names of like their brother's rivals or their cousin's rivals. They'd search the names of people they knew in gangs that lived along the route they had to walk to school. And they would look to see what mood they were in, or they would look to see if they were home, or they would look to see whether they're posting pictures with guns, right? I mean, we're living in an age when everybody posts what they're eating and everybody posts what mood they're in, and people post who they're with. And the young people that I work with would they would reroute their walk to school based on, the up-to-date, up-to-minute posts that people are making on Instagram or on Twitter.
I guess this is exactly like you when you were growing up.
Yeah. So this is what I quickly began to realize is that, whereas I would walk through a neighborhood and you would see someone wearing Calvin Klein CK, which stood for Crip Killer, oh, that's a blood. This is a blood neighborhood I'm in. I have friends who are Crips. I need to be very careful. If somebody walks up to me and asks me where I'm from or who I am, I need to lie. I need to be very careful. Well, when the Chicago gangs kind of broke up, nobody's wearing colors anymore. Like everyone's wearing black, everyone's dressed the same. And so kids have to try to figure out how exactly they can know whose territory they're in. Or they have to know, is the person who's sitting on their stoop who I'm walking past, are they at war with my cousin? And one of the things that I found that I was not expecting whatsoever was the way they were using YouTube and using drill music to try to stay safe. And so drill as a genre originates in Chicago, right? This kind of like hyper-violence, operating in kind of real-time, contemporaneous narration of gang feuds that are going on. And these young people would tell me, they would be walking to school and one of their main strategies they would do is put on headphones but not turn on any music. And instead, they would keep their ears peeled and listen to the drill music songs that were being played on the stoop or in the passing car or by the pedestrian walking the other way, just kind of playing it out of their kind of tinny phone speakers. And what they would be able to do is very quickly learn, oh, I'm in a gang territory that is now at war with, the gang faction where I live. Or, oh, I'm listening to the song that's being played from the stoop. I now know that an alliance, a truce has been forged between this gang and the gang where I live. Or, they're calling out the name of someone who was killed. I didn't realize that person had been killed. This neighborhood is on high alert now, right? In the days after a shooting, these guys are going to be hyper vigilant. So they're more likely to ask me where I'm from or what I'm doing in this neighborhood. And so all these kids, I realize, are using social media in all these ways to stay safe that I had just never anticipated. So this forced me to have to make a Twitter account and make an Instagram account and friend people on Facebook in ways that I had never anticipated. Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose that that's a realization that basically completely turns on its head the narrative that was spreading at that time.
Right.
Which I think gets to the complexity of technological change and how it impacts our societies.
Yeah.
It can be easy to assume negativity and sort of collapse into moral panic about them. But there are sort of simultaneous opposite forces happening. People are using the technology to do harm.
Yeah.
People are also using the technology to protect themselves.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting how you came across that quite early. How did that then, you get these accounts, you then spend 5 years.
Yeah, just about.
Yeah. So there's a lot to talk about there, but I suppose talk me through some of the things that you discovered as you got deeper into that world. You're focusing on social media, drill music's taking off. Right. Chief Keef becomes an international star.
Right.
The music spreads here to London. Yeah. It then gets another life.
I mean, I think just on like the kind of 30,000 foot level, I think it's just really important for us to pause for a moment and sit with this, I think, common narrative that says the rise of social media has kind of one effect, and that effect is to ramp up violence. This was the question that I really wanted to ferret out, and it's one of the questions that I answer in my book. And I'm kind of like the bane of reporters who call me up and want like a quick hit quote, who want me to say, yes, it's creating lots of violence. Because what I do is I drag them through like this nuanced explanation, which says social media is doing a lot of things at the same time. I will say that I encountered some instances in which social media did precede someone being shot. It was a rare occasion. It was, something that did not happen very often. This is not like the modal effect, right? Most taunts and folks, making fun or making light of others online is not resulting in someone picking up a gun and shooting them. And at the same time, there are these countervailing forces where the rise of social media are actually allowing community members to keep each other safe. I've been once the book was published, I ended up writing a lot more about this stuff. And, one of the articles that I write, one of the studies that I published, I talk about this young woman, Danielle, and her younger brother, DJ. And one of the cool things that we learned from Danielle is all the ways she's able to use social media to keep DJ safe. And so, one of the things she'll do is she'll go through DJ's roster to see who he's friends with. And then she can go through the rosters of potential rivals, they're friendless, and see if they have any common network connections. And if they do, she can kind of pull him away from those network connections, right? Maybe there's a young woman that DJ is beginning to talk to, and she's already friends with a potential rival. Or, she can look at the locations of the people who would want to harm DJ. They're at a local basketball court. So when she sees DJ with this basketball and he's about to head to the local basketball court, she can pull him away and she can distract him and she can take him somewhere else. So there's all these ways that people are keeping each other safe. And then, of course, there's this really difficult, really messy relationship between social media popularity and increased victimization. Unfortunately, right, we live in a time when becoming very popular on social media can increase your chances of victimization. In Chicago, as in many urban violent places, you can get some street cred for humiliating or harming, sometimes killing somebody who has made a name on social media. And so young people now face this really difficult conundrum. So what we're looking at are communities of young people who, outside of social media, are never told or treated as though they are worthy or special or should have the kind of time of day, right? These are young people who at school, they're told they're worthless. Every time the cop puts them up against the wall, they're told they're worthless. The security guards at the housing project tell them that they're worthless. The judges, right, when they get a trespassing ticket and they go in to try and clear it, tell them that they're up to no good. And so we have these young people who are seeking out ways to feel as though they're human, feel as though they're worthy. And we've created this technology that allows them to quantify it, right? Every like, every friend, every click, every view is a quantifiable measure of how much I matter in the world, right? And so young people are trying to chase this thing. Some of them chasing it in, more illegal or violent ways. Some of them, even the ones who are chasing it in quite legal ways, face the prospect, unfortunately, of attack and victimization, because they've made themselves look, special, worthy, clickable, likable.
I think everything you've just explained is so much of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation, because you're talking about a relatively specific time in the sort of evolution of social media technology, during the mid 2010s. We're sat here in 2025.
Yeah.
And so much of what you've just said is relevant still. Mm-hmm. I wondered, everything you've just spoken about, how do you see that still playing out as a sort of relevant set of analyses?
Some of the analysis is still very much in place now, but I think we're seeing a different kind of societal reaction. So let me just try to sketch out these two things in the way I'm thinking. So one of the things that I argue in a lot of my work, one of the things I argue in my book is that so much of what we see online is artifice. It's fake, it's not real. There are several scenes that I show in my book where I'm hanging out with a young man who is, wildly popular on social media. He's a very popular drill rapper in Chicago. And we are sitting in his living room watching his kids. We're playing video games. We're grabbing them juice from the refrigerator. But if you open up his social media, which I would do, like this was part of my research practice, he is sitting next to me on the couch, but he's posting videos and pictures of him that portray him with his buddies on the corner with a gun, daring someone to come and do a drive-by, right? So it became very clear just how much of a gap there is between what people are actually doing and the strategies they use to show themselves as like authentic, violent gangbangers online. So I think that the gap between people's real lives and their online lives, if anything, I think has grown.
Agreed.
Even more, precisely because we've all become inured. We've all become...
We're more effective at playing the game.
Oh, they're more effective at playing game. And all of us are better at being online sleuths, right? And peers are better at being online sleuths, right? So at the time, nobody challenged him. But I think in today's day and age, if in 2025, if he had posted those, what we would have seen in the comments is like, hey man, like that's not the weather today. Like it's snowing in that picture. It's not snowing today. Like this is fake. This is fake. And so I think people are getting savvier as kind of fact checkers. And in response, people creating content are getting savvier about making authenticity harder to suss out. So here's the problem with that. So I think that's very much going on. I think it's amplified. We're also seeing a response from society, and I will say in particular, the criminal legal system, that makes that even more perilous and impactful in young people's lives. And so I just completed this study with a colleague of mine at Stanford. Her name's Sarah Brain. And we did interviews across the United States with attorneys to try to see how social media content is showing up in court cases. And we would get these defense attorneys on the phone, and one of the first questions of this interview is like, hey, we hear social media is like coming into court. Is it coming into your cases? And they would laugh. They would laugh at us. And they said, like, this is a silly question, because no matter the case I get, if it's a young person, particularly a young person of color between the ages of 18 and 30, I'm going to get the prosecution's going to use their social media content. If it's a robbery, if it's a fraud, if it's a trespass, I mean, you name it, like anything they can get a hold of. And what they're doing is they are maybe wittingly or unwittingly, I guess it depends on the prosecutor, forgetting about the gap between kind of real life and online life. And they're taking all those online posts that my research shows are artifice, are fake, and using them as though they were fact in court. And one of the cases that stood out to us the most, it happened in California. A young man was a part of a conspiracy case, and the prosecution found no physical hard evidence that this guy had aided his buddies in doing violence or killing some of his rivals. And so lacking fingerprints, lacking eyewitness testimony, they turned to a social media account. And based on essentially 2 Facebook posts, they sentenced him to 25 years to life. And these 2 Facebook posts are him standing in what looks like enemy territory, flashing gang signs. And the prosecution argued that what this Facebook post was doing was letting his fellow gang members know that it was safe to come into rival territory to do their drive-bys. And so the prosecution argued that this is aiding and abetting. So he should be lumped into this conspiracy to murder case, and he goes away. Like he's locked up 25 years to life. We got with we were doing the study at the same time that his case was being argued in front of the California Supreme Court. And we got to sit down with the attorney to like figure out what her strategy was. And in sitting with her, one of the things we learned is that those photos were taken in front of his grandmother's house. So he lived with his grandmother in rival territory. And so he's out essentially like in front of his house doing what we all do, like essentially posting a selfie in our neighborhood. But because the prosecution, because the criminal legal system was so fixated on seeing everything and anything as gang related. And
They've already made up their mind.
Yeah, they had already made up their mind. And I mean, these are older folks, they are not people who live in these neighborhoods. And so it ended up getting overturned. So this guy walks free because the Supreme Court says, no, like this is absolutely normal social media activity. We can't put this guy away for 25 years to life for posting selfies essentially in his own neighborhood out in front of his own house. But the initial case, when this was first raised, there was no objection. There was no consideration that like this might be a performance online. And so a lot of my research now is precisely to try to look at court cases to try to figure out how is it that we're lacking essentially what all of us know about social media is that people are performing their kind of like maybe not ideal self. They're performing the persona that they want everyone to think they are. But like we're all exaggerating. We're all lying, right? Like now that I have social media, like I post every time I publish a study, right? Or I post if I get an award. I don't get an award every day. Like I don't post when my articles get rejected or when my studies don't work out or when I'm having a fight with my wife. Like we don't post those things. We only post the performances that we want a particular audience to see. And it's like, we've forgotten that kind of core element of social media when we're locking people up for life for a couple Facebook posts.
That phenomenon of the courts using social media content and music content in particular is a growing, well, it's a grown one here as well.
Yeah.
And I think one of the big challenges of it, which reflects a wider challenge, is how you as a young person who sees social media and music as a prime, maybe exclusive way of expressing yourself, and you've experienced this really horrible stuff, or you are just copying someone because that's what you're being influenced to do. And even like by wider society and adults, like you're copycatting just like many adults are doing.
Yeah.
You're producing misinformation just like a lot of adults are doing, like political leaders are doing. I think it's really difficult for a young person now, a teenager, wherever you are in the world, to try and navigate that complexity.
Yeah.
At the Youth Endowment Fund, we found that 64% of teenagers, this is in England and Wales, who report perpetrating violence in the past year, say that social media played a role in their behavior. 70% of teenagers say they have encountered some form of real world violence online in the past 12 months, and 82% have seen hate speech online. Point being, whilst I obviously accept, and I think that there's a huge amount of complexity here in both directions to sort of point out that social media is being misinterpreted, that maybe that there is too much fear mongering around elements of its origins or how it's evolved. There's obviously also a lot of risk, and there's also a lot of pain and suffering that can come from being exposed to this type of content now.
Yeah.
What do you think are the particular risks associated with all of what we're talking about for marginalized young people and young people living in poverty, as opposed to the aggregate? Like what makes it particular about a young person living in poverty from your research, but I guess, trying to apply it more widely, that might make them and their navigation of social media more risky? Because this is a form of inequality, right? We've spoken about this before.
Yeah. We can think back to all of those strategies that these young people in Chicago were using to stay safe, just to make it to school, right? Without suffering harm. We've got them pretending to listen to songs. We've got them on social media. I mean, it is it's really hard to articulate, right here, just how suffocating this thing feels. That to be on high alert to, a platform that many young people who are not in violent neighborhoods, who are not in poor neighborhoods, are using to, check out the newest dance craze on TikTok, or to check out the new profile picture of somebody that they find cute in their school, or to DM friends about, plans to skip school and, where I'm at, go to the beach, during third period. And so you can contrast that of kind of what I would think of as like a youthful, kind of beautiful way in which young people are using social media to increase and enrich their social relationships, that is almost cut out of the lives of young people who have to use social media to keep abreast of who was just shot yesterday, or keep abreast of which gang territory am I in? In some of my work, in some of the sociology that I'm really loving right now, we talk a lot about cognitive load, and this is backed up by emerging neuroscience. This is backed up by emerging psychology that shows when people have too much cognitive load, they're unable to perform all kinds of basic tasks. We know that cognitive load related to violence tanks students' test scores. So a colleague of mine at Princeton, Patrick Sharkey, he's shown that in violent neighborhoods, if a shooting happens, test scores for everybody in that neighborhood, kids in that entire neighborhood, sink. And I think it takes something about a week for them to get back up. And this is irrespective of whether you witnessed the shooting or even heard about the shooting, right? So these are kids who haven't even heard about the shooting. They just happen to be in the school where this kind of ambient feeling of vulnerability and loss and trauma is circulating kind of in the air, like a kind of airborne disease. Right. And so if we know that that happens in a kind of ambient sense, even for kids who have not experienced it, I mean, social media is like an amplifier of that, right? So even if you didn't know the victim, even if you didn't hear about the victim, if you didn't hear about the shooting, you might hear about it on social media. And even if you don't, you are getting bombarded with the kind of trauma-soaked social media posts of everybody else, right? So even if the TikTok from your classmate that you are watching, or the tweet or the Instagram reel, or the YouTube short from your friend that you're watching might not mention the shooting, but you can feel that something is off with your friend. You can feel the trauma. They're depressed, or they're thinking about death, right? That stuff I think is amplifying the kinds of findings that neuroscientists and education scholars and psychologists are showing about the ambient effects of trauma in poor neighborhoods.
It reminds me of when a stabbing, it's not a complete equivalent, because there are also guns and shootings that happen here, but obviously nowhere near the same level as America. But I think when a stabbing, fatal or otherwise, happens in London, in the UK, and we see this in our work at the Youth Endowment Fund, I've seen it in my work as a youth worker, the trauma that then floods through that community and has all sorts of impact and sets almost like an atmosphere in a place like a school where all young people have to be, and you've got people traveling in from different neighborhoods. Just like in Chicago, in London, similar things happen, where people are coming in from different housing estates, and they have to be in school when they know that this thing's happening outside of school. It really reminds me of that, which I think is why it's so powerful, your work, and kind of what we're talking about, thinking about how these inequalities play out across the world. That just, it's an inequality of just experiencing life. And I guess social media just has chucked this technological bomb into the mix.
Yeah. This kind of amplifier. No, absolutely. And this is just a couple things on this. The first one is I think that as a society, as the media, I think even academics have yet to really recognize this thing you're saying, that it's about time that we start thinking about trauma as another form of inequality, right? That it's very easy to think about wealth inequality or income inequality. These are measurable. It's hard to measure the relative levels of, trauma that a community is going through, but some communities are experiencing more trauma than others. And it's always kind of baffled me that we're not problematizing this even more, especially, again, coming back to neuroscience, we now have the science that shows what a kind of scar that places on the kind of neurological functioning of young people. The second thing I do want to say about that is I think it's really tempting to kind of throw our hands up in the air, right? That like, this is hard stuff. This is troubling stuff. This is, it makes me want to cry to think about young people going through this. There is a way to harness social media to begin to make a dent in this. So when I was in Chicago, one of the things that I learned from talking to young people is that social media is also a really great barometer of the trauma that's going on in neighborhoods. And we put together this study. It's a computational study where we took hundreds of thousands of tweets, and we used a machine learning program and essentially inputted all the words that we knew were associated with trauma and loss in Chicago. So, very obvious things like, rest in peace, rest up, long live, these kinds of things. These are often the words and phrases that people are using when someone's killed or when it's the anniversary of someone being killed or hurt. And what we found is that we can predict with pretty good accuracy the kind of traumatic levels of young people in neighborhoods by scraping tweets and looking to see when these kinds of things peak. And for a while now, this thing is very hard to get funded for, but we can very easily turn that into a kind of tool for outreach. Right? You can imagine an outreach worker, a youth worker, social worker coming to work in the morning and having a kind of interface where they can look to see, there's 3 neighborhoods that are violent. Maybe there's a lot of gang members, and they need to keep track of their kind of mental state. And what we can actually do is give them the kind of interface that lets them see, oh, in this neighborhood, it seems as though the kids there are peaking in terms of thoughts of loss, thoughts of death, thoughts of, remembering someone who was killed last week or 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And our idea is to harness the power of social media as a place where people go and, express some of their feelings and send social workers in, right? Like this is a neighborhood where
it becomes a solution.
It becomes a solution. Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm glad that you've got this right, because you're right. It's so easy to complain, and analyze the despair. And I wanted to ask you, solutions wise, in your time doing all this work, Chicago or not, what are some of these solutions for violence that you're looking at, focused on, you think is worth a mention? Whether it's to do with social media or not.
Yeah. So I'm a sociologist, so I am obligated to start at the top, to start with the 30,000-foot view. The structural roots of violence are things like joblessness, things like mass incarceration. When people are locked out of the economy, when people are locked out of the kind of symbolic economy of like who is valued in a society, I think it's an easy road toward violence. One of the things that I've turned up, thanks to some of your writing on drill music here in the UK, is that with the rise of drill music globally, right, this kind of genre that is a kind of hyper-violent music that young people are disseminating and it's become the scourge of their governments. No matter where we look, what we find is the social group, ethnic group, immigrant group, who is at the lowest rung of the social hierarchy are the folks that are most making drill music, right? So like Aboriginal youth in Australia and New Zealand, Somali refugees in Vancouver, Black kids on the south side of Chicago, Mexican American kids in California. It's refugee populations. I was in Sweden recently, giving some talks on my book, and it's the same group. And I think it's not a coincidence that we see the same people that's at the lowest rung of whatever society we're looking at, begging for attention in the only pathway they've been given, which is to double down on the stereotypes of immorality, dirtiness, violence that society has given onto them. Because these societies have created only one role that these kids can play, right? And that's of a kind of violent super predator. And so they play it. They play the role because they've been typecast. And so I think for me, one of the big solutions is give them another role. Give them another role that they can possibly play in the society. And you will see I would think, a dissipation, a disappearance of these kinds of kind of social media performances and displays. One other big thing that is just so striking, I've done a lot of work in Chicago with violence interrupters. And these are people who are former gang members, formerly incarcerated. And when a shooting happens in Chicago, their whole role is to come and wrap their arms around the victims' families to try to stop them from going and doing a retaliatory shooting. One of the things that I've been blown away that they're able to do to stop people from going and shooting is say, hey, if you get in the van with me right now, I will take you and you can get a job. And people get in the van and go. When I first saw this, I was like, no way. Like, this is somebody who's heated, who just had a cousin or an uncle shot, and you're telling me that they are willing to not shoot somebody if you will just give them a job? And I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, like over and over and over again, which to me just shows how much we've been overlooking a pretty straightforward solution. Is that, like, if you give someone an economic opportunity or an economic chance to improve their situation, they will forego what seems like the most base, instinctual, emotionally driven choice possible. And so I think giving people some symbolic dignity and giving people a way to earn an income, I think we can solve this pretty quickly, actually. I think it's a problem of will and not know-how.
We're going to finish there. What a place to finish. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, this is great. Thank you.
If you'd like to find out more about how to keep young people safe from violence, hit the link in the description.